Okay, so this is Muscles Lecture Part 2. Part 1 talked about the functional characteristics of the three different types of muscle: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. We're going to really focus on skeletal muscle because we'll talk about cardiac more when we talk about the heart, and we'll talk about smooth a little bit more when we talk about digestion. So we're really focusing on skeletal muscle. And as you saw in the functional characteristics, one of the things that skeletal muscles do is contract or shorten. And so, in order to move a part of your body, the muscle has to shorten. It pulls on the bone across the joint and it shortens. What that means is that there has to be another opposing muscle that can shorten to undo the motion. So muscles always come in pairs of what we call an agonist, which is the prime mover, and then the antagonist, which is the opposing group. Opposing muscle group. So if you think about your elbow, your biceps muscle contracts to flex at the elbow, and then when you want to straighten or extend your arm, your tricep shortens to pull the opposite way and straighten your arm. So there's always muscles that come in these pairs, one for flexion, one for extension. Sometimes it's, with everything, it's a little more complicated than that. But for the most part, they always come in those pairs. So when eventually we get to muscle anatomy, I want you to be thinking about kind of the agonist and the antagonist. Okay, muscles always shorten. That's all they can do. But they can contract in some different ways. Okay, so if you do any sort of like weight training, you might be familiar with these different types of contractions. So a concentric contraction is sort of a normal, like what I was just explaining, muscle contraction with movement, and then the agonist moves, the antagonist undoes the movement. So that's a concentric contraction, sort of typical. Isometric contraction occurs when the muscle contracts, so you tighten it, you activate the muscle groups, but it doesn't actually shorten. There's no movement involved. And this is if you're holding something heavy, you want to lift it up, but it's so heavy that your muscle contracts, but it can't move the object. Okay, so that's isometric. And then the third one is called eccentric contraction. And this occurs when you are holding something, you contract the muscle, but it's so heavy, for instance, that it lengthens the muscle. It's like stretches it out. So you don't get any, like if you're trying to flex at the elbow, you don't get any flexion. Instead, it kind of pulls it and extends it more because whatever you're holding is too heavy. So concentric contraction are kind of what we expect to occur with muscles when they're under sort of normal tension. Eccentric occurs when you're trying to move something too heavy and you just can't hold it, and the object pulls against the muscle. And then isometric contractions occur when there's tension, but there's no movement occurring. So this is what I just talked about. Isometric is there movement? No. Okay, so when we look at muscle structure, in order for skeletal muscles to move, they need to get signals to move. And so we call that muscle fiber plus signaler. We call that a motor unit. So a motor unit is consisting of a motor neuron, so a nerve cell, that's going to get input from the brain and then send the signal to the muscle fiber. Okay, so a motor unit is the nerve plus muscle fibers, and it could innervate a great many muscle fibers, or it could just innervate a few, depending upon the location. So here you see the spinal cord is here, and you can see motor neurons coming out. And a motor neuron, to form a motor unit, like I said, it can innervate many, many muscle fibers. If this was in the leg, for instance, there are some really large muscle groups, the quads and the hamstrings, that are going to have large motor units. So all of these muscle fibers are going to be activated at the same time. A small motor unit might be somewhere like the fingers, where you need to be able to do more precise small motions. So just a few fibers are going to get activated at once to give you sort of lots of options and flexibility. So the bigger the motor unit, the more muscle fibers are activated at once, and generally, like, the bigger the movement is going to be. Okay, so here we see what's called the neuromuscular junction. So in the motor unit, we have the neuron and the muscle fiber. So this is the connection between the two. So I'm going to highlight some things. So we have first a motor nerve fiber, a motor neuron. Okay. The axon, that long wire, is there, covered in a myelin sheath to help with the conduction. Okay. And the axon ends at what's called the axon terminal. So that's just the end of the axon that's going to connect to something. And at the bottom, sort of where the connection happens, there are all these synaptic vessels. Okay, and they contain the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, so I'm going to write about acetylcholine and then I'll talk about acetylcholine. Okay, so acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. So it's a chemical that transmits a neuronal signal. So it's translating from an electrical impulse in the neuron to a chemical impulse that can cross the gap, the synaptic cleft, and be taken in by the muscle to start muscle activity. So signal comes down, the ACH gets released, it crosses the gap and gets bound to acetylcholine receptors in the sarcolemma, which is the muscle membrane. And then that starts the cascade that results in muscle contraction. So electrical signal from the nerve, the motor neuron, ending at the axon terminal, acetylcholine is released, travels across the gap, and binds to receptors in the sarcolemma. So here's that kind of in more words. So once the acetylcholine crosses the gap, it initiates what's called an action potential. So it's getting it ready to contract, and that's called excitation. The action potential travels all along the muscle fiber membrane. And the important thing about that is that once it starts, it can't be stopped. So it's all or nothing. It either will happen completely or it won't happen at all. There's no like in between. So that spreads along the muscle fiber membrane, so at the surface first. And then it travels deep into the muscle, causing calcium ions to be released. Okay. So calcium binds to the actin. We're going to talk about actin and myosin when we talk about the sarcomere on Monday. So calcium ions act on the actin. Myosin heads attach to the actin, so they bind together, and then the muscle shortens. So that's the contraction step. And then finally, ATP binds to release the myosin from the actin, and the whole thing starts again. So the neurotransmitters bind, they get the action potential started, and that leads to the release of calcium ions, which then starts the actual muscle contraction occurring. The all or nothing law, when we think about it, means that when a muscle fiber starts to contract, so it gets the signal, the action potential starts to propagate down the membrane, that particular muscle fiber will contract fully. But it doesn't mean that like your entire bicep muscle is going to contract. It means that one muscle fiber, one cell within the bicep will contract. So it's not that your muscle is going to like contract all at once. It's just for that particular cell, once it starts, it has to continue. Okay, so next class, we are going to talk about how those steps, those action steps, the action potential, the calcium, the actin and myosin binding, the ATP coming in, how all of that works together to actually cause the muscle to contract. And this is the part that your assessment is on, which is why I want to do it kind of together as a class. So, to be continued.